Our next speaker today is Matthew Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is a senior research fellow and lead scholar on the project for the study for American capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is also an adjunct professor of economics at George Mason. He specializes in economic freedom and economic growth, public choice economics, and the economics of government favoritism. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Mitchell. I'm hoping that's going to come on over there. When you do that, let's see. It should.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bill, and thank you all for coming. I feel at a bit of a handicap coming after two politicians. Economists are not known for their ability to make very compelling remarks. You can tell there's an easy way to tell a extroverted economist from an introverted economist. An introverted economist will spend his whole talk looking at his shoes. An extroverted economist will spend his whole talk looking at your shoes. Being an economist, I have a little bit of a masochistic streak. And one of the things I like to do every so often, about this time of year actually, is pour through the State of the State addresses of the governors around the country. The reason why I do this...
I just finished that myself.
All right, we've got several up here. We should form a little meeting or something. So one of the reasons why I do this is to sort of get the temperature gauge of what the states are dealing with, and it's a nice way to see the different environments. So I had to go back a couple years, see what Governor Perry was saying, and one of the things Governor Perry expressed in his last State of the State is that Texas is ready and able to compete with other states. Now, the interesting thing is this sentiment is found in just about every State of the State address. And this is good because governors, legislators, policymakers increasingly realize that they are in competition with every other state and indeed every other country in the world. And they are in competition for jobs, for businesses, and for tax dollars, because every new business that is created, every business that is relocated could happen here, or it could happen in my home state of New Mexico, or it could happen in Singapore. And it's an increasingly global economy, and states do need to recognize that. But there are, I would argue, broadly two different ways that states can compete. And the first is to say, we are open for competition because we have the best environment in which to do business. You come to our state and you will experience, you will find high quality services for low prices, very low taxes, limited regulations, a good tort environment, a good environment in which to do business. And one of the best ways actually to define this is by the term what economists call economic freedom. And economic freedom is, it's the characteristics of a region that have high in economic freedom are that individuals are able to choose. Most choices are based on individual choice. There's not a mandate to buy a certain product, for example, in which businesses are able to enter and compete freely. You don't have to have the right connections or you don't have to jump through a bunch of different hoops, in which goods and services are exchanged through open markets, and in which persons and property are well protected. Those are the four elements of economic freedom. And in fact, economists have spent quite a bit of time over the last several decades developing measures of economic freedom. One of the best articulations of competing by providing a best economic environment is by Governor Rick Scott of Florida. I hasten to add that Florida is no better at this than many other states, but he does have a nice way of saying it. And the way that the governor put it is the best thing government can do to create a level playing field for all competitors, and then to get out of the way so that they can compete. What we can do is to continue to put Florida companies in a position to outcompete companies in all other states and countries. So economists have been measuring economic freedom. What are the results? Well, this is an international comparison. It's a study conducted actually by one of the professors is Bob Lawson here from Texas. What the authors did is they rate each of the countries according to their level of economic freedom. How intrusive are taxes? How intrusive are regulations? How well protected is property? What's the state of the rule of law? All of those things. And as you move further right on the scale, you get to countries that are more and more free. And as you move further north on the scale, up on the scale, that's the level of per capita production. And this is essentially the best measure economists have for how prosperous people are. And as you can see, there's a very strong positive upward sloping trend. If you do much social science, you know that a picture like this is actually very rare. This is an extraordinarily strong, statistically significant relationship. Places that are more free are more prosperous. You can see it through the chart. You can also see it if you do more sophisticated econometric studies that try to control for other countervailing factors. You don't have to go through and do all the studies because tons and tons and tons of them have been done. In fact, this is one of the most studied phenomenon in the social sciences. You don't have to read all these papers because somebody else has. And I'm going to put up their review of it. In a recent study looking at 52 separate studies of economic freedom and growth, the authors found that regardless of the sample of the countries, the measure of economic freedom, or the level of aggregation, there's a solid finding of a direct positive association between economic freedom and growth. This is a very important and key ingredient to prosperity. We have measures of economic freedom that are also done across states. Mercatus has one. The Fraser Institute has another. Other organizations, Tax Foundation, ALEC, there's several different measures of economic freedom across the states. Most of them point in the same direction. And sure enough, across state level analyses, you see the same sort of pattern. If you look at average economic freedom in the 2000s and compare it with real economic growth, there is, again, a positive and statistically significant relationship. Those states that are more free enjoy higher levels of growth. And there you can see Texas. It's one of the more economically free states, and it is also one of the more prosperous states. This is not a coincidence. The authors of the Mercatus study offer some advice, and they say that to policymakers interested in attracting new residents and businesses, we'd recommend measures to increase freedom and reduce the cost of living. But there is another way that states can compete. And this is with targeted incentives that basically say we're not worrying about our environment at all. We're trying to make sure that we let the environment be what it is. We're going to suspend the rules for particular firms or industries. So most states are relatively transparent about it, and you can go to their websites. In Texas, you can look at the Economic Development website, and you can read about the Texas Enterprise Fund. You can also read about the Texas Emerging Technology Fund, and you can read about several other host of incentive packages, everything from tax abatements to outright subsidies that are designed to privilege particular firms or industries. So what's the relationship between targeted incentives and economic growth? Well, here, it's exactly the opposite. Those states that hand out more subsidies per capita actually experience slower, statistically significantly slower growth compared to those states that offer fewer subsidies. So a state like Nevada or North Dakota, states that give very few subsidies out, actually tend to experience much higher rates of economic growth compared to Arkansas or West Virginia or Texas. So I would argue that these types of targeted incentives are really just one aspect of ways that government can privilege particular firms or industries. We all know about the bailouts, and most conservatives and libertarians recognize the bailouts as an affront to economic freedom and to free markets. But there's all sorts of other ways that government can intervene on behalf of and privilege particular firms or industries. There are regulations that privilege some firms, there are subsidies, there are tax credits, there's grants of monopoly. And all of these things, I would argue, set off a set of pathological problems for an economy. So for one thing, they tend to undermine competition. When you privilege particular firms or industries, that means you tend to it tends to monopolize certain industries, and that leads to higher prices and lower quality goods. It also means that firms invest time, money, and resources in asking for privileges. Well-paid lobbyists, lawyers, accountants, these are very, very smart and productive people who could be thinking of new ways to create value for customers. Instead, they are spending their resources trying to come up with new ways to obtain privileges from government, and that's a waste, economically speaking. So it's estimated that between $1 and $3.5 trillion annually is spent in the business of seeking privileges. So to give you a perspective on this, this is somewhere between the size of the stimulus that we got and the stimulus that Paul Krugman thinks we should have had. It's a big cost, right? It also means that talent is misallocated. So rather than individuals going to school and learning how to become engineers and learning how to become customer representatives and focusing on the customer, they're going to school to learn how to obtain privileges. This has a subtle and long-term impact on economic growth because it changes the allocation of talent. There's a relatively famous study a few years ago where they looked at the allocation of talent, and they found that in those places where people are a higher percentage of the population is in the business of seeking privilege, they tend to grow slower. How much slower? It's about 0.78% slower growth per year. So you can say 0.78%. That sounds like something we could handle, right? That's relatively minimal. Well, let's go back to 1985. This is actual per capita growth for the United States over the last 40 years. Now let's go back to 1985 and see what would have happened if, starting then, we had grown at 0.78% slower or faster. Well, it turns out our per capita production would be $54,000 rather than $42,000 per person. It's a huge difference. What's that little dip at the end on the solid blue line? Anybody know? It's a Great Recession, right? It's the most calamitous economic event in any of our lives, and it pales in comparison to slower growth due to privilege seeking and privilege granting. There's another problem, is that governments are not particularly effective at figuring out what the next big business is going to be. As Larry Summers, President Obama's economic advisor, told the president, government makes for a very crappy venture capitalist. It turns out government is not particularly effective at this, and you can see this in the housing business. We spent over a decade through taxes and regulations and subsidies systematically privileging housing and housing-related sectors. It turns out that that the government was trying to encourage people to build more houses in Florida and Nevada than people wanted to build, and they called it wrong. And it turns out it was a house of cards. A sustainable path of business, a sustainable path of economic growth is built around customer desires, not around what politicians think is going to be the next big thing. Real quick, I know my time is just about up. The other thing is that it tends to undermine the legitimacy of business and government. So it's very difficult to find an objective way to hand out privileges. So what often ends up happening is privileges are handed out to well-connected firms. And it turns out, if you look at in the run-up to TARP, those firms that lobbied more and engaged in more political activity, every $1 invested in lobbying was associated with $486 to $585 extra dollars in TARP. There's actually a 1 down there. You can't even see it. It's a big return on investment, right? Well, this undermines the legitimacy of capitalism. People start to think that this is what capitalism is about. In no place in the world is crony capitalism further along than in Italy. And Luigi Zingales, an Italian economist, points out that in Italy, a recent survey of business people found that the most important determinant of Italian success in business is knowledge of influential people. 80% of them said that. Focus on customer, hard work, those are things like 4, 5, 6 down in the list, right? So it doesn't just undermine business, but it also undermines legitimacy of government as well. I always like to end with a quote from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, because it's George Mason who wrote this. And he said, no man or set of men are entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments or privileges from the community, but in consideration of public services. This is a basic feature of our Republican government. Government should exist to promote the general welfare, not the specific welfare of particular firms or industries. My colleague, Maurice McTeague, is a little bit more pithy. He says the best economic development program is not to need one. If you have a targeted economic development program, and it's a mission of failure. It's an admission that your environment is not one that will attract businesses on its own, and that you have to suspend the rules in order to attract businesses. So with that, I'm going to just point you to, if you want to learn more, go to the Mercatus website, check out our research areas and the study of American capitalism. There you can find a lot of resources and studies. We will actually have a couple of studies in the next few weeks to months on state economic development and targeted incentives. Put up my contact information. Love to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
All right. Questions from the audience? Go right ahead.
Yes. My question is for Mr. Mitchell. The Mercatus Center. I'd like to know how they measure economic freedom and what effect it would have on that measure on the overall score of a state or a country that through its legislature or Congress or official government body has decreed that it is the government of that land is above the law. It can destroy a person's business, take their property, admit that it did so in violation of the Constitution and laws, and then say, but you know what, we're above the law. They call it sovereign immunity. So we don't owe any restitution to the victim. What effect would that have on that country and the perception of the world of their economic freedom for the citizens that live in that land?
It's a great question. So first, I guess I'd separate it into actual economic freedom and measured economic freedom. So in terms of actual economic freedom, unquestionably, that would be an extreme violation of economic freedom. It's easier to think about and define actual economic freedom than it is to actually measure it and turn it into an objective measure. But when persons and property are protected, and when property can't be expropriated, and when government is constrained by the rule of law, that's where economic freedom can be found. Now trying to take that concept and measuring it is tricky. And so what we would hope is that the measures that we actually develop get at that and correctly downgrade a country or a region if it fails to live up to that standard. So in terms of the Mercatus measure, and this is true of most indices of economic freedom, the idea is you start with publicly available objective data. So they look at, in the case of Mercatus, they look at regulations and then fiscal policy. And within fiscal policy, they divide it up and look about half at taxes and half at spending. So they look at how much is spending per capita. They look at the top marginal tax rates across all different tax bases. In terms of regulations, they actually go to the code books and they see what kind of regulations are there on in the workforce, what kind of regulations are there on utilities, are prices allowed to adjust, and they measure these as broadly as possible across all the states. Now, one thing is the Mercatus measure of economic freedom, and this is true also of most of them, is it's all transparent and it's online. And if you don't like the way that they've weighted it, you can weight it a different way. So if you think that rule of law should measure way more than, say, regulation, then you can do that and you can adjust it. But it's all up on the website. Freedom in the 50 States is the Mercatus measure. So the other one that I use for the international is Fraser's, the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World, and that you can find at freetheworld.com. It's a great resource. As I said, it's been used by hundreds of peer-reviewed academic studies.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
You're listening to one of those engineers that actually started a business in its garage and turned it into an international business. And certainly we had competition, and that was something we always had to work with. But the biggest problem we had as a small business was actually government. And We closed our business 30 years ago, and since that time, I have seen more intrusion by government. And the thing that concerns me probably one of the most is the marriage of big government and big business. I see this trend here in Texas, and I'm concerned about that, and have testified in committees about that. And this next session, I hope that whenever you all meet in your committees and you establish your agendas, that you try to diminish this trend in Texas. And it's not basically a question, but basically a concern that I'd like to express to the panel. And I'd like to compliment Mr. Mitchell on his presentation. That was my experience in business very closely, and appreciate your comments on that.
All right. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the panel. I hope you enjoy lunch afterwards, and join me once again in thanking the panelists today.
Thanks, George.
Pleasure.